Have you ever stopped for a moment, taken a deep breath, and asked yourself, am I truly living or am I just surviving? Most of us spend our days running from one task to another, chasing deadlines, expectations, and responsibilities, thinking that one day, maybe when things settle down, we'll finally start enjoying life. But what if that one day never comes? What if real life has always been happening right here, right now, while we were too busy to notice? Shihengyi reminds us of something so simple, yet so easily forgotten. Life is not meant to be endured, it is meant to be experienced. Each sunrise is not just another beginning, it's an invitation. Each breath we take is a chance to wake up to the miracle of being alive. Think about it. When was the last time you tasted your morning tea or coffee as if it were the very first time? When was the last time you looked at the sky, not just as part of your commute, but as a canvas of infinite beauty? Life is constantly whispering to us, calling us to slow down, to feel, to notice, to be. The truth is, life is not measured by the number of years we accumulate, but by the depth of the moments we allow ourselves to live. Some people spend 80 years on this earth without truly touching life even once, while others, in just a few moments of presence, taste eternity. But why do so many of us miss it? It's because we've been conditioned to believe that happiness lies somewhere in the future. When we earn more money, when we buy that house, when we find the perfect partner, when we retire and finally have time. Until then, we wait. And in that waiting, life slips quietly through our fingers. Shihengyi's teachings cut through this illusion with piercing clarity. He tells us, stop waiting for life to happen. Life is already here. It is happening in this very breath, in this very heartbeat. The question is, are you awake enough to see it? This is why the first lesson is not about fixing yourself, not about becoming someone different, but about remembering that you are already standing in the middle of a miracle. The simple act of being alive is extraordinary. Every sound, every sight, every sensation is a doorway into wonder. Imagine a child seeing rain for the first time. Their eyes widen, their laughter bursts out as drops hit their skin. They reach their hands out in pure delight. Nothing has changed about the rain, it has always been falling. What has changed is the way it is received. That same childlike wonder still lives inside you. It's waiting to be awakened. So this journey we are about to take together is not about adding more to your life. It's about peeling away what blocks you from experiencing it fully. Stress, fear, attachment, distraction, these are the veils that cloud our vision. Remove them, and suddenly, life shines with a clarity so sharp it can bring tears to your eyes. And perhaps the most important truth to remember as we begin, you don't need to wait for a perfect moment to start living. You don't need to travel to distant lands, earn vast wealth, or accomplish great achievements. Right where you are with what you have is more than enough. Because joy is not something you chase, it's something you uncover. This is the invitation of Shihengyi's wisdom, to step out of autopilot and into awareness, to stop surviving and start living, to rediscover the art of being human. And as we continue, we will dive deeper, not with abstract theories, but with practices, insights, and perspectives that can transform the way you see the world and the way you see yourself. Because life is not waiting for you. It is unfolding here and now. And the only real question is, will you live it? As we begin to awaken to the truth that life is for living, a deeper question naturally rises. Who is it that is living this life? We move through our days wearing countless masks, parent, worker, friend, dreamer, survivor. Yet beneath all these roles, who are we really? To truly experience life, we must first know the one who is experiencing it. And that begins with self-awareness. Self-awareness is like holding up a mirror to your own soul. It is the ability to step back and observe, not just the world around you, but the world within you. Your thoughts, your emotions, your fears, your desires. To watch them come and go without clinging, without judgment. Think about it. How often do we let anger drive our words before we even realize we're angry? How often do we make choices out of fear, mistaking it for logic? Without awareness, we live as if we are sleepwalking, reacting instead of choosing, drifting instead of directing. Shihengyi teaches that self-awareness is the foundation of freedom, because once you can see your patterns clearly, you are no longer their prisoner. The moment you notice, this is anger rising in me, or this is fear whispering in my ear, you create space. In that space, you have a choice to follow the old habit or to walk a new path. It's like standing at a crossroads. Without awareness, your feet automatically take the road you've always walked, even if it leads to suffering. But with awareness, you suddenly realize there are other roads. You can turn, you can pause, you can choose differently, and that single act of seeing changes everything. But awareness is not only about recognizing what hurts you, it's also about discovering the treasures hidden inside. Your strengths, your gifts, your inner wisdom. Many of us underestimate ourselves, thinking we are smaller than we truly are. Self-awareness shines a light on your potential. It reminds you that within you is not just weakness and doubt, but also courage, creativity, and resilience waiting to be claimed. Imagine your mind as a vast house with many rooms. Most people live only in the front hallway, rushing in and out, never exploring further. But self-awareness invites you to walk deeper, to open doors you've never touched, to explore the richness of who you are. Some rooms may contain shadows, old wounds, unhealed pain, but others hold treasures you never knew existed. And the more you explore, the more at home you become in yourself. And here's the paradox. The more you come to know yourself, the less you are trapped by the idea of self. Because you realize your thoughts are not you. Your emotions are not you. They are passing clouds while you are the sky. To be aware is to discover that your true essence is spacious, open, unbound. Self-awareness does not come from forcing or controlling. It comes from gentle attention, from sitting quietly and listening to your breath, from noticing how your body feels when you're stressed, from watching your mind race and instead of jumping into the storm, choosing to observe from the shore. It begins with small acts of noticing, and over time, it becomes a way of being. And when you cultivate this awareness, life itself changes. Conflicts become easier to navigate because you understand your triggers. Relationships deepen because you see not only your own patterns, but also the struggles of others. Joy becomes fuller because you are present enough to taste it. This is why self-awareness is not just the first step of inner growth. It is the key that unlocks all other doors. Without it, we are blind. With it, every experience becomes a teacher, every challenge becomes a lesson, and every moment becomes an opportunity to awaken. And so, as we journey deeper, the next realization begins to emerge. If self-awareness allows us to see ourselves clearly, then the next challenge is learning what to do with all that we see. What do we do with our pain, our attachments, our endless grasping? The answer lies in a lesson that is both simple and profound: the art of letting go. The more deeply we come to know ourselves, the more we begin to notice the weight we carry. Old grudges, regrets, expectations, fears, they cling to us like stones in a backpack, slowly bending our shoulders, exhausting our spirit. Self-awareness reveals these burdens, but seeing them is only the beginning. The true art of living comes when we learn to set them down. Letting go is not about losing, it is about gaining freedom. Imagine holding a rope tightly in your fist while someone is pulling on the other end. The harder you grip, the deeper the rope cuts into your skin. The pain is not from the rope itself, it's from your refusal to let go. Life works the same way. Much of our suffering comes not from the situations we face, but from the way we cling to them. We cling to the past, replaying mistakes, reliving wounds, as if carrying them will somehow change what has already been written. We cling to the future, worrying about what might go wrong, as if anxiety could protect us from uncertainty. We cling to people, possessions, identities, believing they define who we are. And yet, the tighter we hold on, the more fragile we feel, because deep down we know everything is temporary. Shihengyi reminds us, true strength is not in holding on, but in knowing when to release. Letting go is not weakness, it is courage. It is the courage to trust life, to trust yourself, to trust that even if you release what you've been clinging to, you will still be whole. Think of the seasons. Trees do not cling desperately to their leaves in autumn. They let them fall, trusting that spring will come again. In the same way, we too must learn to let go of what no longer nourishes us so that new growth can emerge. But letting go doesn't mean forgetting, nor does it mean rejecting. It means honoring what has been, learning the lesson it brought, and then loosening your grip so that it no longer defines you. It's about carrying memories without being imprisoned by them. Ask yourself, what am I still holding on to that is holding me back? Perhaps it is an old story you tell yourself. I am not good enough. Perhaps it is anger towards someone who hurt you long ago. Perhaps it is an expectation of how life was supposed to be. These attachments keep you locked in the past or trapped in illusions. The moment you loosen your grip, you begin to breathe again. A space opens in your heart where peace can enter, and in that space you discover something profound. The world feels lighter not because it has changed, but because you are no longer carrying it on your back. Letting go is not a one-time act, it is a daily practice. Every day we are invited to release something, a worry, a resentment, a fear, even just the need to control what cannot be controlled. Each act of release makes us lighter, freer, more open to life. And here lies the paradox. The less you cling, the more fully you can love. When you no longer hold people tightly out of fear of losing them, you are free to appreciate them for who they are. When you no longer cling to success, you are free to give your best without being crushed by failure. When you let go of needing life to be a certain way, you are free to experience life as it truly is, vivid, raw, and beautiful. This is the gift of letting go, not emptiness but space. Space for joy, space for love, space for presence. And presence is where life truly happens. Because once we are no longer trapped by the weight of yesterday or the anxieties of tomorrow, we finally arrive in the only place we can ever live, in this very moment. And that brings us naturally to the next step. If letting go is the release of what binds us, then what remains is the gift of being fully alive right here, right now. The power of presence, the art of living in the present moment. When we finally loosen our grip and let go of the burdens of the past and the fears of the future, what are we left with? Silence, stillness. A moment so simple yet so profound. This moment, the one unfolding right now. Presence is life's greatest gift, and yet it is the one we most often overlook. We are here, but our minds are elsewhere. Our bodies are sitting in a room, but our thoughts are trapped in yesterday's regrets or tomorrow's worries. And in that constant drifting, life slips past us unseen. Shihengyi reminds us, the present moment is not just another part of life, it is life itself. Yesterday is a memory, tomorrow is a dream. The only place we can truly breathe, touch, feel, and live is now. Think of the last time you were completely absorbed in something, watching the sunset, laughing with a friend, listening to your favorite music. For a brief moment, time seemed to disappear. You weren't thinking about the past, you weren't worrying about the future. You were simply there, that is presence, that is where peace lives. But why is it so hard to stay present? Because the mind loves to wander. It drags us into endless stories, what could have been, what should have been, what might happen. The mind wants to control, to plan, to analyze. But life does not unfold in the mind stories. It unfolds in the raw, unfiltered now. To be present is to step out of those stories and return to what is real. The sound of your breath, the weight of your feet on the ground, the colors and shapes in front of your eyes, the heartbeat within your chest. Presence is not somewhere far away, it is always here waiting for you to notice. And here's the secret, the more you practice presence, the more vivid life becomes. Food tastes richer. Conversations feel deeper. The air feels fresher. Ordinary moments, washing your hands, feeling the warmth of sunlight, hearing birds sing, suddenly shine with extraordinary beauty, because the present is not empty, it is overflowing with life. Presence also transforms suffering. Pain often grows larger because we add layers of thought on top of it. Why me? This always happens. What if it never ends? But when you bring awareness to the present moment, you see the pain as it is, sharp, fleeting, alive. And without the extra weight of your story, it becomes lighter, more bearable, and presence deepens love. To truly listen to someone without distraction is a gift rarer than gold. To sit with them fully, not rushing, not judging, not planning your reply, but simply being there. That is presence. And that presence is felt more deeply than any words you could ever say. Shihengyi teaches that life's true richness is never in the length of time, but in the depth of presence. A single mindful breath can contain more peace than hours of restless distraction. One genuine moment of presence can be worth more than years lived in a haze. So how do we return to presence? We begin with awareness. Notice when your mind has wandered, gently bring it back to the moment. Anchor yourself in your breath, in your body, in the sensations around you. It is not about forcing stillness, but about remembering where life truly is. And the more we return, the more natural it becomes. Presence is like a muscle. The more you practice, the stronger it grows. Over time, you find yourself less entangled in yesterday, less anxious about tomorrow, and more alive in the now. Because ultimately, to be present is to awaken. It is to see that life has never been waiting for you in the distance. It has always been here, whispering in every heartbeat, hidden in every breath, alive in every moment. And as this awareness grows, another truth begins to reveal itself. Presence is not just freedom, it is also power. But to truly embody that power, we need something else, something that sharpens and anchors us, the discipline to stay on the path. Presence reveals the beauty of life, but beauty alone cannot carry us through every storm. To remain grounded, to keep walking the path when distractions and temptations call, we need something deeper, discipline. Many people hear the word discipline and think of rigidity, harshness, or punishment. But true discipline is not about controlling yourself with an iron fist. It is about caring for yourself so deeply that you commit to what nourishes your soul, even when the easier path tempts you away. Shihengyi explains that discipline is freedom in disguise. At first it feels like effort, but in time it becomes the very thing that sets you free. Without discipline, we are slaves to impulses, tossed around by every mood, every craving, every distraction. With discipline, we reclaim our power to choose. Think of the body. Without the discipline to move, to train, to nourish it well, the body becomes weak and restless. But with consistent practice, strength grows. The same is true of the mind. If we let it run wild, it becomes noisy, scattered, easily shaken. But when we train it with meditation, with mindful awareness, it grows still, sharp, resilient. Discipline is not about perfection. It is about practice. It is about showing up each day, even in small ways, to align your actions with your values. It is waking up a little earlier to sit in silence. It is choosing to pause before reacting in anger. It is dedicating time for reflection instead of numbing yourself with endless distractions. These may seem like small choices, but they shape the very quality of your life. The truth is, without discipline, even the most beautiful insights remain only words. We may understand the importance of letting go or being present, but unless we practice, unless we return again and again, those insights fade like dreams upon waking. Discipline transforms knowledge into wisdom and wisdom into a way of life. And here's the paradox. The more discipline you cultivate, the less effort life requires. At first, it feels like climbing uphill, choosing restraint, choosing consistency, choosing focus. But over time, discipline becomes natural. It becomes a rhythm, a flow, a way of living that feels effortless because it is aligned with your deepest values. Shihengyi often reminds his students, a river cuts through rock not because it is powerful, but because it is consistent. That is discipline. Not force, not struggle, but steady, patient persistence. Day by day, choice by choice, carving a path of clarity and strength. And discipline does not mean denying joy. On the contrary, it deepens it. Because when you train yourself to resist the pull of distraction, you discover a joy far greater than fleeting pleasures. The joy of mastery, the joy of inner peace, the joy of living with integrity. But discipline also reveals something else. No matter how strong, no matter how mindful we become, life will still place obstacles before us. Challenges will come, sometimes small, sometimes overwhelming. And it is in these moments that all our awareness, all our letting go, all our discipline is put to the test. The question is not whether challenges will arise. They always will. The real question is, when they appear, will we collapse under their weight or will we rise to meet them? No matter how disciplined we become, life will always test us. Obstacles will rise, storms will come, and difficulties will appear when we least expect them. Many of us see challenges as punishments, as cruel interruptions to the lives we planned. But Shihengyi offers us a different perspective. Challenges are not there to break you, they are there to shape you. Think of fire. Fire can destroy, but it can also transform. Place raw metal in the fire and it becomes stronger, more refined, more resilient. In the same way, the challenges of life are the fire through which your spirit is forged. Without resistance, muscles do not grow. Without trials, wisdom does not deepen. Without storms, the roots of the tree do not anchor firmly in the soil. Challenges are not the enemy of life. They are the very conditions that allow life to unfold in its fullness. And yet, when hardship comes, our first instinct is often to run, to hide, to wish it away. We ask, why me? Why now? But the truth is, no one escapes struggle. The question is not whether we face it, but how we face it. Shihengyi teaches that every difficulty carries within it a lesson. Pain reveals where we are still attached. Failure shows us where we need patience. Loss teaches us to cherish what is fleeting. Each challenge, if met with awareness, becomes a teacher pointing us toward growth. But meeting challenges does not mean pretending they are easy. It does not mean denying the pain or forcing a smile. To face challenges is to stand with courage in the storm, to feel the rain, to acknowledge the fear, and yet to take one step forward anyway. That is strength, not the absence of struggle, but the willingness to walk through it. Think of a bamboo tree in the wind. A rigid tree may snap, but bamboo bends, sways, yields, and then returns to its form. That is resilience. Facing challenges is not about becoming unbreakable, but about becoming flexible, learning to bend without losing yourself, adapting without abandoning who you are. And here's the secret. Many times, it is the very challenge you resist that holds the key to your transformation. The failure that humbles you is also the seed of your greatest wisdom. The heartbreak that shatters you is also the doorway to compassion. The difficulty you dread is the fire that clears away what is false, leaving only what is real. When you look back on your life, you will notice this truth. It was not the easy days that shaped you, but the hard ones. It was not comfort that gave you strength, but adversity. Every scar has made you wiser. Every obstacle has carved depth into your soul. This is why facing challenges is not something to fear, but something to embrace. To look into the eyes of hardship and say, I will not run, I will learn, I will grow. And in that moment, the challenge loses its power to crush you, and instead becomes the ground on which you rise. And once we learn to face challenges with this openness, something else becomes clear. Strength alone is not enough. To truly thrive, we must also find balance. Balance between effort and ease, between holding on and letting go, between the outer world and the inner self. After facing challenges, after being tested by storms, one lesson shines brighter than all others. Life is not about extremes, it is about balance. Shihengyi reminds us that many people lose their way not because they lack strength, but because they swing too far in one direction. Some chase endless achievement, burning themselves out in pursuit of success. Others cling to comfort, avoiding every difficulty and slowly lose their vitality. Too much effort breaks you, too much ease makes you weak. The art of living lies not in choosing one side, but in walking the middle path. The Buddha himself called this the middle way, the wisdom of balance. To walk this path means you do not fall into indulgence nor into self-denial. You do not live only for pleasure nor only for discipline. You live with awareness, adjusting moment by moment like a sailor steering the boat across shifting waves. Think of breathing. If you inhale too long, you suffocate. If you exhale too long, you collapse. Life itself is a rhythm of balance between in and out, effort and rest, giving and receiving. When you lose this rhythm, you suffer. When you return to it, peace arises naturally. Balance is not a rigid state, it is a living dance. Some days require more action, others more stillness. Some seasons of life ask for sacrifice, others for joy. Balance means knowing when to push and when to pause, when to hold on and when to let go. It is not about perfection but about harmony. And yet balance is often misunderstood. People think it means living in the middle in a dull and colorless way. But true balance is not boring, it is powerful. It gives you stability like the roots of a tree and freedom like its branches reaching toward the sky. With balance, you can be strong without being harsh, soft without being weak, disciplined without being rigid, free without being lost. Imagine a tightrope walker. To stay on the rope, he must constantly adjust, a little to the left, a little to the right. If he leans too much in one direction, he falls. Balance in life works the same way. It is not found once, it is practiced daily, moment by moment. Shihengyi often teaches that balance begins within. If your mind is restless, even a quiet place will feel chaotic. If your heart is calm, even in the midst of noise, you will feel peace. This is why meditation is so central to the Shaolin path. It trains the inner balance, the still point inside the storm. And when balance is found within, it flows outward into all parts of life. Your relationships become healthier because you know how to listen as well as speak. Your work becomes more meaningful because you know how to give effort without losing yourself. Your body becomes stronger because you know how to train with intensity and also with rest. Ultimately, balance is not a destination, it is a way of being. It is the gentle wisdom that whispers, not too much, not too little, not too hard, not too soft. Walk the middle way. And in walking this way, you discover that life itself begins to feel lighter, more natural, more alive. But even balance, once found, is not the final step. Because the greatest treasure of the Shaolin path and of life itself lies in something deeper, the journey of self-realization. To know who you truly are beyond fear, beyond desire, beyond illusion. When you begin to live with balance, something extraordinary awakens. The awareness that you are not walking this journey alone. Every step you take, every breath you draw is part of a greater rhythm, a web of connection that binds all living things. Shihengyi often reminds us, to know yourself is powerful, but to know yourself as part of the whole, that is freedom. True connection is not about clinging or losing yourself in others. It is about recognizing that life flows through all beings, that we are like waves rising from the same ocean. Separate for a moment, yes, but never apart. In the modern world, loneliness has become one of the deepest wounds. Surrounded by millions, many still feel empty, disconnected, unseen. Why? Because connection is not about the number of people around you. It is about the depth of presence you share. Two souls meeting with honesty, even for a moment, can nourish more than 100 shallow interactions. Connection begins with yourself. If you are at war within, your relationships will mirror that conflict. If you carry peace inside, others will feel it, even without words. That is why monks can sit in silence, yet people around them feel uplifted. Connection is not what you do, it is the energy you radiate. But connection also grows in how you show up for others, listening without judgment, offering without expectation, being present instead of distracted. Sometimes the most profound gift you can give someone is simply your undivided attention, the sense that in that moment nothing else matters more than the life unfolding in front of you. Think of nature. A tree does not live only for itself. Its roots hold the soil, its leaves give oxygen, its shade offers rest. And yet it also receives water from the rain, light from the sun, nourishment from the earth. Connection is this cycle of giving and receiving without keeping score, and it extends beyond people. Connection is with the earth beneath your feet, the air you breathe, the sky above your head. When you feel this, gratitude arises naturally. Suddenly, a sip of water feels sacred. A bird's song feels like a blessing. The world is no longer a place you use, it becomes a family you belong to. This is why isolation, though sometimes necessary for reflection, is never the ultimate goal. Even monks, after years of solitude, return to share their wisdom with the world, because the point of the journey is not to escape humanity, but to bring back a deeper sense of humanity. When you realize this, life transforms. The barriers between me and them begin to dissolve. You no longer see strangers, you see reflections of yourself. You no longer ask, "What can I take?" but "What can I give?" And paradoxically, in giving, you receive more than you ever imagined. Connection does not mean you lose yourself. It means you expand yourself. You are still you, but you are also part of something far greater. And in that realization, loneliness fades. Because how can you ever be alone when life itself is flowing through you, around you, and as you? From this place of connection, another truth begins to unfold. That life is not just about ties and belonging, but also about the wisdom we carry forward, the lessons we distill, the meaning we make, the legacy we leave. When you discover connection, when you feel the invisible threads that weave you into the fabric of life, there arises a quiet, powerful realization. Nothing is truly missing, and this realization blossoms into gratitude. Gratitude is not about waiting until everything is perfect. It is about seeing the perfection already present in what you have. Shihengyi often says, gratitude transforms ordinary moments into blessings and simple things into treasures. To live with gratitude is to recognize the gift of being alive right now. Think about it. How many breaths have you taken today without noticing? How many times has your heart quietly kept you alive, beating without complaint? How often have you walked on legs that carry you wherever you wish, or opened eyes that allow you to see the world's colors? We overlook these miracles because they feel ordinary. Yet gratitude teaches us, the ordinary is not ordinary, it is extraordinary in disguise. Gratitude is a shift of perspective. The same life can feel empty or full depending on the lens you wear. Two people may live under the same roof, eat the same food, breathe the same air, yet one complains while the other feels blessed. The difference is not in what they have, but in how they see. And gratitude is not only for the good moments. It also embraces the challenges, because when you look back, often it is the hardest experiences that shaped you the most. The failure that humbled you, the heartbreak that deepened your compassion, the obstacle that forced you to grow stronger. Gratitude does not deny the pain, it honors it as part of the gift. This is why monks bow, not only to teachers and to wisdom, but also to difficulties, to storms, to life itself. Every bow is a reminder. Thank you for shaping me, for guiding me, for teaching me. Gratitude is powerful because it dissolves comparison. Instead of asking, why don't I have what they have? You begin to ask, how lucky I am to have what I do. And suddenly, envy fades, greed weakens, and peace takes root. Because the truth is, you cannot be truly grateful and truly unhappy at the same time. Gratitude and discontent cannot live in the same heart. And gratitude naturally flows outward. When you feel thankful, you want to give. You want to share. You smile more, you listen more, you forgive more easily. Gratitude makes you lighter, and in turn, it makes those around you lighter too. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine waking up tomorrow with only the things you were grateful for today. What would remain? Who would remain? This thought awakens a gentle urgency, not to wait, not to take for granted, but to cherish what is already here. In the end, gratitude is not a practice you do once, it is a way of seeing. It is a choice you make again and again until it becomes your natural state. And from this place, life ceases to be a race for more and becomes a celebration of enough. And so, as we come closer to the final chapter of this journey, gratitude prepares the heart for the greatest lesson of all. To live, not clinging, not fearing, but embracing the gift of existence itself. One last reminder that life is not measured by years, but by the depth with which we experience it. Every journey has an end. Yet the greatest journeys lead you back to where you began. Only now you see it differently. After walking through self-awareness, letting go, presence, discipline, facing challenges, balance, connection, and gratitude, one truth shines through them all. The path of life always leads you home. Home not as a place but as a state of being. home within yourself. Shihengyi teaches that the purpose of all practice, all wisdom, all struggle is not to become someone else but to return to who you truly are. Beneath the noise of desire and fear, beneath the layers of expectation and identity, there is a still point inside you. A quiet self, unshaken by storms, untangled by illusions. To return here is to return to freedom. You see, the world often tells us to keep running toward success, toward wealth, toward recognition. But no matter how far you run, you will always circle back to yourself. And if you do not know who that self is, even the greatest achievements will feel empty. The true victory is not in conquering the world, it is in coming home to your own heart. Returning to yourself does not mean withdrawing from life. It means entering life more fully, with clarity, with courage, with compassion. It means carrying stillness into movement, carrying wisdom into action, carrying peace into relationships. It means no longer seeking happiness outside, but realizing happiness is the natural fragrance of a mind at rest. And perhaps the most beautiful part of this return is simplicity. You no longer need to prove, to fight, to chase endlessly. You live lighter. You smile easier, you love more deeply, because you understand, life is not a problem to solve but a gift to experience. So as this journey closes, remember this, you are enough as you are. You have always been enough. The answers you seek are not in distant places but in the silence of your own being. The teachings, the lessons, the struggles, they are all guides pointing you back to this truth. Return to yourself. Trust that within you lies a wisdom older than fear, a strength deeper than doubt, a peace untouched by time. Live from that place, and every step will carry meaning. Every breath will carry freedom. And so, the circle is complete. You began by seeking life's lessons, and you end by realizing that the greatest lesson is simply this: to be here fully as yourself. If this journey spoke to your heart, if these teachings helped you pause, reflect, and breathe a little deeper, then I invite you to walk further with us. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom, where we continue to share timeless lessons from the Buddha and the wisdom of Zen, translated for the challenges of modern life. Together, let's keep exploring what it means to live with clarity, compassion, and peace. And if this message resonates with you, share it with someone you care about. Because sometimes a single teaching, a single story can change the way we see the world. Until our paths cross again, may you remain present, balanced, and at peace.